And one of the, as you mentioned, one of the key areas for dramatic improvement is democracy. So what don't you like about democracy? Or to be less accusatory, what's wrong with our democracy?
Yeah. So, it's not that everything is wrong with, democracy is a good system. Most people want to live in a democratic society. I think 90% of people in the UK think democracy is good in theory, but less than 20% think that it's working in practice. And, I think there are lots of reasons why that is the case. I think one problem is the voting system. I think that first past the post, which is the voting system that we have here, it leads politicians to focus in a completely disproportionate way on marginal constituencies, the constituencies that are likely to change hands from one election to the next. And it means that voters who are living in those particular areas get an enormous amount of attention, and there's a lot of attention paid to their views. And at the moment, the red wall seats are the sort of particular focus of political attention here. And that other voters who live in safe seats that haven't changed hands for a long time are basically ignored. And if the basic principle of democracy is one of political equality, of everyone having an equal chance to take part in and influence the political process, then that just doesn't seem like a very good voting system. It also leads to a politics that tends to be dominated by two parties. In a first-past-the-post system, it's very hard for small parties to make any kind of headway. And I think that's a problem too, because when you only have two parties, it's hard to imagine that two parties can really represent the diversity of political views that exist in a modern society. And I think it leaves a lot of people feeling politically homeless. And again, that's not a good system. So I think that's one part of the problem, and I think the solution to that is to embrace proportional representation. And I can't remember, was your question more about problems or solutions?
Problems first.
We'll stick with problems.
Yeah,
okay.
we'll
I'm always wanting to get to
solutions in a
solutions. That's
Too right.
That's the sort of spirit of the book, is to move towards solutions rather than focus on problems. But I think the other, maybe even bigger problem is the role of money in politics. And in the 2019 election, just over 100 super donors were responsible for nearly half of all the donations that went to political parties in the UK. Each of those super donors giving somewhere close to £500,000 each. And I think, again, if we come back to the basic principle of democracy being one of political equality, it's just obvious that is the most blatant violation you can imagine of that kind of principle, and it gives the rich a very direct influence over politics that the rest of us don't have, and it means that parties are geared towards the interests and the preferences of this rich and unrepresentative donor class rather than the majority of the population who they should be paying attention to. So I would say those are the two biggest problems: the voting system and the role of money in politics.
So let's talk about proportional representation, and then we'll come to sort of private money's negative effects on our political systems. With proportional representation, there are some sort of European democracies you can look at and that have systems more representative than our own. Are you concerned that those systems, they obviously create a lot of coalitions, and sometimes you can sort of end up in a situation where almost the tail ends up wagging the dog, if you know what I mean. The minority partner in the coalition, critics will say, secures undue influence as the kingmaker in those systems. So what's the case for proportional representation?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that the basic case for proportional representation is that under proportional representation, every vote counts equally regardless of where it's cast. So that's the fundamental argument in favour. I think one of the, no voting system is perfect. Every system has drawbacks, and we have to sort of decide what our priorities are. I think the tendency for the downside of proportional systems is that you can have a proliferation of lots of different parties, and that there's much more of a focus on coalition building. But I think we shouldn't overestimate or sort of overdo how different that is actually to first past the post. Even in first past the post, we have a couple of big parties, but those parties are really coalitions of different factions representing different views, and there's all sorts of behind-the-scenes negotiations that are happening within those parties. So it's not that there's no coalition building going on, or that small groups aren't able to wield outside influence. It's just that all of that stuff is kind of happening out of sight. So I think, in a way, what proportional representation does is bring all of that out into the open. And, you know, negotiation between coalitions, coalition building, that's what democracy is about. That's how you govern in a society where people hold different views.
You just sort of conjured an image of the ERG and the Conservative Party into my head there, and saying that was a fair point. So
I should have used that example. Thank you.
You can take it. You can take it. Put it in your pocket. So let's talk about funding for political parties. What's the answer? Is it state funding? Is it, you know, you get a certain amount of cash from the state, and that's all you get to run an election? How do you propose resolving that problem?
Yeah, so I think some form of state funding has to be the solution, but I think the conventional model of state funding isn't a very good one. So typically the way that works is that parties will be given a certain amount of money based on their share of the votes in the last election. And the biggest problem with that is that it makes it very hard for new parties to sort of enter the fray. Because if they haven't won seats in the last election, then how are they going to get any funding? And without any funding, how are they going to win any seats in the next election? It's kind of a terrible catch-22 situation. So I think a much better system would be what I call a democracy voucher system, where you give every citizen a certain amount of money, say £50 per year, that they can give directly to the political party of their choice. And I think, you know, the great advantage of that is that it puts the question of funding right into citizens' hands, and it, you know, just in a stroke ensures political equality. I should say, I think it's important to combine that with a cap on private donations. So the sort of system as a whole would be one where individuals can give privately possibly a small amount of money, I'd say in the maximum of the low couple of hundreds of pounds, or maybe nothing at all. And the focus would then shift to this system of democracy vouchers where people can give, donate to the party of their choice. And, you know, I think that would just completely transform the incentives that exist in our political system. So rather than parties chasing after this rich and unrepresentative donor class, they would have to appeal equally to all of us. And it would also give people another opportunity just to get engaged in politics. It would lead to people, you know, it's just another moment in the year where you have to engage with politics, where you might talk to your friends about, you know, which party you think has got the best policies. It also means that parties might, you know, that you can imagine parties organising fundraising events that actually draw in normal people and not just like whoever the latest billionaire is. Actually, I'm relying on you to give me a good example. I could only think of Jeff Bezos, who's probably too unrepresentative to really be relevant. But anyway, you get the idea. And, you know, I think that it sounds like, I mean, would be a very big change from the system that we have at the moment. But I think in practical terms, there's really no reason why we couldn't introduce it. And interestingly, having been a kind of philosopher's pipe dream for a while, that system now exists in Seattle in America. So in 2017, they introduced a democracy voucher system after a local referendum, and that system governs local elections, rather than national elections there. And they've now run 3 elections under that system, and it works really well, you know, and the consequences are exactly what you would expect. More people getting involved in donating to parties, particularly people who didn't give money before, and also those elections being more competitive, which is really so important. You have more people standing and more challengers beating incumbents, and that kind of, you know, it's in a democracy, it's that competition between politicians that really ensures a link between representatives and the people that they're representing. So, you know, I think that's a system that has worked very well there, and there's really no reason why we shouldn't extend it to the national level.